Good evening. Did global warming put the chill on Texas coastal fisheries? Well, it didn't take long for global warming alarmists to blame the massive fish die offs in Texas coastal waters last month on man made climate change. Are they right? Even though what brought the die offs was deep freeze, was prolonged sub zero temperatures, very unusual for that area. Join marine chemist and limnologist Dr. David Shorman to learn about the ins and outs of this new controversy on tonight's From the Stacks program with Cornwall Alliance. Hang in here. We'll be back in just a moment. Good evening. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We have a fascinating discussion for you this evening with Dr. David Shorman, who is a marine chemist and limnologist. In fact, I'm going to ask him to explain what a limnologist is for us all. We're going to be discussing the fact that millions and millions of fish died off because of the extreme cold that hit the American South and particularly the Texas coast during February. We'll be getting into that discussion in just a moment. First, just a quick indication of who we are and what we're doing. I am the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a ministry engaging laymen and policymakers to teach about biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ and the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that come along with that. We're glad that you've been able to join us this evening, and we hope that you will enjoy all of the program. We would also like to let you know that we have a new product available to donors to the Cornwall Alliance. This is a fascinating new study by my friend Inder M. Gotlani, longtime economist with the U.S. Department of the Interior, called Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality. Dr. Gotlani takes on the claims of all kinds of disastrous consequences of climate change already occurring and shows that almost every single one of them is not a disaster, it's not occurring, and the hard observational evidence is quite contrary to that. For the month of March, as our way of saying thank you when people give any amount, doesn't matter how little, we will be glad to send a copy of this fabulous new study completely free, and the donation will be 100% tax deductible. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply enter impacts of climate change and promo code 21-03, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. Well, again, as I said a moment ago, it didn't take long for global warming alarmists to blame climate change for the death of millions of fish in Texas coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. This is a rather fascinating claim in that it wasn't heat that killed these fish, it was cold. So we have to discuss this with us this evening, Dr. David Shorman, a marine chemist and limnologist, and he's written on these issues many times in the past. He's also been our guest in the past discussing the impact of climate change on salmon fisheries in the Alaska region. David, thank you very much for joining us. And first, tell us a little bit about yourself, what got you into this work, and how this particular topic became interesting and important to you, and define the terms marine chemist and limnologist for us.
Okay, well, for me, a marine chemist, was specifically nutrient chemistry, studying water chemistry and nitrogen, phosphorus, especially those inputs to estuaries, to where freshwater and saltwater comes together and mixes. Most people think of it as a bay, like Galveston Bay, Tampa Bay, things like that. And so I studied the water quality and those main chemicals in particular, those impacts on the ecosystem. And so uh, there's like oceanographers which study of ocean saltwater. There's limnologists who study freshwater. There's no like specific term for people who study estuaries where freshwater saltwater mix together, that brackish water. But so I got a limnology degree, a PhD from Texas A&M, marine chemistry degree, my master's degree from the University of Texas Marine Science Institute, and just the study of Texas ecosystems. I live in Hawaii now, but when I did live in Texas, all the way back in high school, I remember writing a report on redfish, and there's an organization called the CCA, Coastal Conservation Association, that was actually formed when I was in high school, the early 1980s. And I wrote a report on just how the fishing was being impacted. One of the worst freezes in the last 30, 40 years, last 40 years was in 1983. And that killed millions of fish, and then there was also a lot of overfishing going on in the bays as well at that time. And so I was there, just avid fisherman, 1980s. Then 1989 saw two more freezes, and after the December 1989 freeze, there was a big algae bloom called the brown tide that formed, and that's actually what I studied as part of my master's research in 1991-92 at the Marine Science Institute in Port Aransas, Texas. So we studied basically what most scientists think happened there is that the big nutrient pulse that happened from all of those decomposing fish and invertebrates too, that triggered the brown tide algae to proliferate and spread from Baffin Bay to Copano Bay, which is, I don't know exactly, it's over a 100-mile stretch of connected bays, all connected together by the intercoastal waterway, and then also just other waterways. And so that whole region was affected by the brown tide. But
Mm.
yeah, so I studied that, and one of my conclusions was it seemed like a large flushing event would be what it took to get rid of the brown tide, and that is what happened. So um, in Copano Bay, that was in the form of a big flood. A few years later in Baffin Bay, that was in the form of a hurricane with the storm surge and also the
Mm.
rainwater. So, anyways, so I've been interested in these big freeze events, what they can do. It's a sad phenomenon that it happens, but I think it's also interesting that the main fisheries that are impacted, God's designed those fish to be periodic spawners. That means that they usually spawn once a year, and they lay a bunch of eggs, hundreds of thousands for some of them, and so
Mm.
they can just really uh, you know brought spawn have a lot of young in a hurry, and so it doesn't normally take a long time for the system to recover from a big freeze like that. So seems like 2 to 3 years is what I've heard. And yeah, so in the what's up with that article that was posted yesterday that I wrote, um, one of the commenters also mentioned that about 2 to 3 years recovery, and I
Mm.
believe that the man who posted that comment, HD Hess, he's the author of or co-author of Fishes of the Gulf of Mexico, a popular book
Mhm.
in Texas and along the
Ah,
Gulf Coast.
okay.
So. Yeah.
Yeah, you just had this article published yesterday in whatsupwiththat.com titled Some Texas Coastal Fisheries Devastated by 2021 Freeze, but It's Nothing New. And why was it important to throw that last little bit into that title? It's nothing new. Uh, that would indicate that some people were acting as if this were some, history-making thing, something that doesn't happen, hasn't happened before. Uh, who's playing around with the facts on this?
Well, I think it'll be interesting just to see um, if this gets suppressed or not. Just this massive fish kill due to cold. I mean, there's weather, there's climate, but as the climate gets warmer, you would expect the weather to get warmer and not as cold. Um,
Yeah,
and so I just think it's good for people to see that this is, I think, really, really good evidence that against just the climate alarmism and
yeah,
impending climate catastrophe, the imminent threat that I've heard it called. So
yeah. No, I
yeah,
think
I think it's
you're not actually arguing, are you, David, that the simple fact that we had this severe cold snap is itself evidence against a long-term warming. What you're arguing, it seems to me, is hey, if this had been a severe heat wave, the global warming alarmists would have been up in arms saying, oh my goodness, here's proof, global warming. But when it's a severe cold snap instead, they don't say, oh, here's proof instead, we don't have global warming, we have global cooling. Instead, they just ignore it,
right,
or maybe they even argue that somehow or other it was the warming that caused the cooling. Uh,
right,
Tell us more
right.
about this.
Yeah, and that is one of the things I've seen is that this is because of global warming. And in fact, there is one comment in that article just below it that mentions there was in the stratosphere above Siberia a large heat input or a temperature increase that and that's typically what happens. Again, nothing new. This is how these what they refer to as a polar vortex. That's how they get started. Is there's a high temperature um, over Siberia, and basically it pushes that Arctic air mass. But again, that's happened before. It happened back when global cooling was the hype. Back in the late 70s into the early 80s when we had the really bad freezes in 1983, so
Mhm.
along the Texas coast. But yeah, what I guess that's one of the frustrations for me, anyways, is just the people saying it's an imminent threat, climate change, and when they say climate change, they mean global warming is an imminent threat. But
Yeah,
then, we look at
yeah,
patterns like Texas coastal freeze kill events, and we see that pattern happening over and over throughout history.
yeah.
So I would expect if it was just an imminent threat that we would not have that because the temperatures would be so high that we wouldn't be dipping down low enough to have these big events.
Okay, you wrote in your article that the back-to-back winter storms kept temperatures low enough, long enough to kill millions of fishes, thousands of sea turtles, and countless other marine creatures. And then you went on to say, contrast this reality with the fallacious idea that climate change is an imminent threat. Uh, we simply cannot be simultaneously headed towards overheating the planet while breaking century old low temperature records. Um, you mentioned in this millions of fish killed, thousands of sea turtles killed, and countless other marine creatures killed by this cold. Uh, can you describe for us what the situation was and perhaps still is like along the Texas coast? I mean, I have seen situations in small landlocked lakes where something has resulted in a sudden death of a lot of fish, and boy, it can be pretty stinky. But I wouldn't think that
Yes.
it would be millions of fish. This has got to be really quite something to see.
Right. So if if we want to, we could roll one of those YouTube videos that I reference in the article that has some aerial footage. This is something, we didn't have back in the last major events, 1983 and 89 events, and here you can see this is in the Rockport Corpus Christi area, and this video I believe is by Thresher Fishing. Anybody can go watch that on YouTube like we're doing now, but you can see the white patches there. Those are dead fish. Is You might think seagrass is supposed to be green, but it's brownish color from the air, and then the lighter color is sand. And now some good news: if you're looking along the edge of that sand, you can see live swimming fish. Um,
Hmm.
and but there are quite a few fish in there as well. And one thing to keep in mind is that um, salt lowers the freezing. So this is salt water. The typical fish that lives in an estuary, its body salinity, its blood and other liquids, those are at a lower salinity. They're more like fresh water. So the salt water can actually not freeze because it's got salt content, but then the fish freezes. That's a strange phenomenon that um, happens in these situations. So there, you can see some dead fishes. There's looks like on the left there's probably a speckled trout. It's a popular
Hmm.
game fish. It's not in the family like of rainbow trout and salmon, but speckled trout are spotted sea trout there in the
Huh.
cyanid family, along with redfish or red drum. You
Huh.
can actually see fish swimming right there. And I
Uh-huh.
I actually took that footage and some other drone footage and tried to estimate um, a fish kill count. And actually one positive thing about that is that about half of the fish that I counted were alive. Um, and um, I estimated between 10 and 17 million fish dead on the entire Texas coast. Mostly it's the lower half of the state that was the heaviest. And this area was hit pretty hard here in Corpus Christi, Rockport. We have, and it wasn't just fish, there was invertebrate. I think we have um, photo one of, big fish kill in Rockport. Now these are all very small fish. Some of the fish in that video were probably 2 to 3, 4 pound speckled trout and other fish. But here I just did like a quick count of this photo here from Rockport, and about 20,000 fish, and most of these are probably mullet and another fish called a pinfish, and probably some others in there for sure. But those are 3 to 5, 6 inch long fish there. But
Hmm.
probably 20,000 just in that photo right there. Turtles were also impacted heavily as well. We have I think our photo three of the sea turtles, and this is a Texas Parks and Wildlife vessel, and hun- these are cloned sea turtles here. They're not dead, but they collected them during the freeze, and in fact the South Padre Island Convention Center, I think they had upwards of 3,000 cold stunned sea turtles in there for a while, and
So the sea turtles
there was
were
a
holding a
in
convention.
yeah.
Was
Yeah, there
was
was
that
I
convention
mean
to
a
protect
great
the cold?
humanitarian effort to get them warmed up and get them inside, but even then um a lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them died. But
So the
yeah,
sea turtles
so
might have appreciated a bit more global warming, huh?
right, right, and and yeah, and again, all of this to say that we're not saying, my point wasn't that there hasn't been warming. I think the um, duration between extreme events, we haven't had 1989, not this bad. There was one around 2010. I can't remember exactly, 2010 or 11. Um, that did kill some fish in Texas, mostly not game fish like speckled trout and
Hmm.
redfish, but more of the mullet and the pin, things like that. But there was one in 2010, and I know that it did impact snook in Florida, and also they, I think they closed, or they greatly restricted speckled trout fishing in the Carolinas as well after that. So that was 2010 or 2011 when that happened. But
I
this
see.
one, just the duration of it and everything, um, of the cold, that I think what made this one, more like the 1983 and 89 events.
I see.
Um,
And
yeah,
actually, it's been a good while since the last pretty significant freeze kill fish along the Texas coast, hasn't it? Hasn't it?
right, right. So yeah, since 1989, and I think, if you look at just the history of it, there's a good article that I reference in there, Texas Parks and Wildlife article from 1996. um, and it goes into the history of all the way back to the 1500s, and Cabeza de Vaca, Spanish explorer, um, um, mentioning in his notes a fish kill. And
Hmm.
there's some really interesting history if you're into that. It, in that article, there's a big table in the article that just goes through, or in the research paper, and it goes through, every year, and what happened. Looks at important factors like the duration of the cold, not just, I mean, it can get down to 30 degrees for 5 minutes. That's not a big deal. Um, it's if it's below freezing 30s, 20s, and the water temperature especially, if that gets 45 or below for more than 24 hours, that's when it really starts impacting the Texas
Hmm.
fisheries.
Hmm.
So yeah, and that
And
hasn't
it
happened.
takes a good deal longer for the water to drop in temperature that much because it is so much more massive than the air, right? But then
Right,
if it does drop that much, it takes it longer to recover, longer to rewarm,
right,
right? Again, because of the mass
right.
of the water.
Yeah, the
So
capacity. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um, so one of the things that you note from that report is that on average, since the 1800s, major fish kill events have happened about every 10 to 15 years. But in this instance, we've been more like what, about 35, excuse me, about 35, 38 years since the last one.
32,
That
yeah,
should
since
seem to be
since
good news, right?
right, right. You would, I mean, sea turtle populations have skyrocketed. Fishing has been really good, along the Texas coast. I've got a couple of pictures there. Picture four, I think that was actually 2012. That picture four that I have there. That's a limit. Back then, the speckled trout limit was 10, and redfish 3. And that was pretty regular fishing. And then 2019, I have a photo there with my grandsons. Just incredible fishing for all sizes of redfish, speckled trout, um, along the Port Aransas jetties there. But yeah, they, and really, the just consistent good fishing, but also, one of the big things I've noticed, is the massive increase in sea turtles. Um, When I was
Oh,
in high school in Texas, you just didn't hardly ever see sea turtles. When I was working on my um, master's degree in 1990 to 92 in Port Aransas, not really many, but now you go down there. Sometimes I'm at the jetties in Port Aransas, and um, you have to be careful when you cast because there's sea turtles feeding on the algae all along the jetty, and
oh.
yet have to watch out for them so
Are
that you don't
these,
snag them.
David,
Excuse me.
are these the same sea turtles that are being, that are what? Marine biologists are very concerned about them as a threatened species. I used to live in South Florida, and all along the beaches there are places that are marked off as turtle sanctuary spots where they tend to lay their eggs, and you can't go to those parts of the beaches. You can't have lights nearby, and so on. Are these
Right.
the same species? And are we
I'm
seeing a
I'm not
significant
familiar.
recovery
I'm
going
not
on?
familiar with the ones in Florida. I know most of the ones in that picture are green sea turtles. Most of the
Uh-huh.
ones I see around Port Aransas and other places are green sea turtles, but there's also the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, which is and I really haven't kept up with that. I don't know what the status is on that, but I know along the Padre Island National Seashore, they've always been very concerned about driving on that. And if you see sea turtle laying eggs, they go and collect them and they incubate them because the babies have a better survival rate um, if they're able to collect them and incubate them in the lab. Um, so, but I would assume that the Kemp's Ridley are increasing, but I don't know enough about that.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
but I mean, it looked to
So
me
what are
like most of those turtles in that photo, most of them in the videos I saw from the convention center were green sea turtles, but I'm sure some of them are also
yeah.
Kemp's Ridley.
Okay, so we've had this couple weeks long deep freeze that killed millions of fish and thousands of turtles along the Texas coast. What can people who live along that area do to help with the recovery? Is this simply a matter of stand back and let nature take her course, or is there stuff that ordinary folks along that area can do to help out with with watching the fish populations come back?
I think the main thing is just conservation, good stewardship. Especially game fish wise, spotted sea trout, speckled trout, they are super popular fish. And they were, of all the game fish, impacted the greatest. And so, you know, I see a lot of people on YouTube and other places, saying, lay off the speckled trout, or even, don't go fishing for a while. Let the fish have a chance to recover. Um, I watched a YouTube video uh, that was produced over the weekend, I guess. Same one that did the aerial footage, the Thresher Fishing YouTube channel, and he showed a couple of redfish that he caught, and they they seemed like they were starving. Just the way they hit his lure,
Hmm.
just inhaled it, totally inhaled it, and it's like that image of all of the dead fish in Rockport. That's happening all around the coast right there. Their food source is dead. That's not all the invertebrates too. Crab, shrimp, sources besides just fish.
Hmm.
So I
Okay.
don't know. I haven't heard anything about invertebrates and how those have been impacted, but I'm sure that they were to some extent. Um, an advantage
Hmm.
of invertebrates like crabs, they burrow in the mud, and at the bottom, the mud is typically the warmest place. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that is an
Okay.
advantage that they have, but
Yeah.
I'm sure a
Yeah.
lot of them were impacted negatively.
Now,
So
in your article, you mention how what you call a nutrient pulse from decomposing fish killed by the freeze itself brings an additional problem. I want us to discuss that in a moment. First, I just want to remind our listeners and our viewers that for the month of March, the Cornwall Alliance would love to give you a free copy of this amazing new booklet, actually 52-page oversize book, really, called Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality by Inder M. Gotlani. This takes a whole variety, a large number of the different claims of disasters caused by climate change, things that are supposedly already happening, and it compares the claims with real world observational measurements. And again and again, it shows that the claims are simply false. This is the kind of thing that you really need to share with teachers in schools near you and so on, because the public is generally very much frightened about man made global warming, and the observational evidence indicates that it needn't be. So, during the month of March, we'd be delighted to send a free copy of this as our way of saying thanks whenever somebody gives a gift of any size, no matter how little, to the Cornwall Alliance. All you need to do to request your copy is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the form, when you come to the comments field, just enter uh, impacts of climate change and promo code 21-03. We'll be glad to send it, and your donation will be 100% tax deductible. Okay, so back to our guest, David Shorman. David is a marine chemist and limnologist, and I just learned tonight what a limnologist is. He's somebody who studies particularly the chemistry of freshwater bodies rather than ocean, saltwater bodies. And so thank you, David, for teaching me that. Now, you mentioned in your article, this article that you published yesterday in whatsupwiththat.com. That's WATTSUPWITHTHAT.com, whatsupwiththat.com. You published this article, Some Texas Coastal Fisheries Devastated by 2021 Freeze, but it's nothing new. In here, you discussed how what you call nutrient pulse from decomposing fishes can lead to an algae bloom that itself is an additional problem for these coastal fisheries. Can you just discuss that for us a little bit? Educate us.
Okay, yes, it's you and I have talked about the red tide in Florida before,
Yeah.
and how that's um, there's natural and anthropogenic or human caused sources for nutrients. Um, there's iron coming in all the way from the Sahara Desert across the Atlantic Ocean and dropping in the Atlantic around Florida, and that's an important nutrient for the red tide algae. There's um, there's fertilizer runoff that comes in as well. There's just from decomposing animals in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic on the other side of Florida. There's um, nutrients that get upwelled from the bottom from all those decomposing animals, and that can just fuel and feed a red tide. One particular algae that's annoying, I guess, there's always algae in the water. Phytoplankton.
Uh-huh.
Phytoplankton are microscopic algae that float in the water, and filter feeding organisms consume those. And one that's annoying, just because it makes the water so murky and brown, is the brown tide algae. And in 1989, after the December freeze in 1989, a few months after that, um, they started seeing brown tide algae blooms in Baffin Bay, and then 150 miles north of there, all the way up by June or July of 1990, the brown tide had spread all the way up to Copano Bay,
Hmm.
and then it remained there as far north as Copano Bay until around March or so of 1992, and that's when there was a big
Hmm.
flood event that flushed it out of um, of the Copano Bay region. few years later, hurricane came, flushed it out. But yeah, that these animals, this mass amount of fish and turtles and invertebrates, they die and then they just start decomposing, and that's food for other animals. That's just a natural thing. It's that happens every day. It's just this is a way more than usual, and so uh, that just allows algae to take off. And another thing that can happen during a freeze is it doesn't just kill the fish and the invertebrates; it can kill the algae. And so it's almost like it
Hmm.
resets the system, and whoever can take advantage of that first wins. And so you get
Whoever, whoever being not people, but the various marine
algae.
species.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
algae, different kinds of fishes. Yeah, whoever can take over that particular niche, fill that void the quickest. And algae populations in ecosystems, they're always waxing and waning. There's usually for phytoplankton, the floating type of microscopic algae, there's typically one that dominates. Sometimes scientists call that the paradox of the plankton. It's just like, why isn't it ever like a 50-50 split or 25-25-25 kind of thing? It's always there's one that dominates and then the rest are in the handful of percentage points below that. And so this brown tide, what happened in 1989 and other times too, is it was able to take advantage of the nutrients. And some scientists believe that it was a particular type of nitrogen that that the decomposition was giving off um, in the form of an ammonia that they preferred over other types of um, microscopic algae didn't prefer that type, and so that also helped the brown tide to dominate for several years. So,
okay.
but a natural thing, it wasn't because of um, man-made nutrients or anything.
All
It's
right.
a natural result.
Okay. Now, near the end of your article, you make a prediction. You say another major winter kill will occur in the next 30 years. And I assume you still mean along this Texas coast.
Right.
Climate catastrophe will not. Let's all do our part to encourage conservation of Texas coastal fisheries as they try to rebound from this devastating freeze and focus more on real environmental issues like clean air and water and abundant and diverse wildlife. That is to focus more on those rather than on alleged catastrophic man-made global warming. Uh, what are things that perhaps Texas could do to be better prepared the next time around, perhaps to reduce the amount of damage that a similar deep freeze would bring? Is there anything that they can do to protect the waterways from this?
Well, I think like Texas Parks and Wildlife, they do have some good regulations in place, and they already have different locations that are known fish gathering places. They're deep. They stay warmer longer. Harbors is one in
Hmm.
particular, and they will send out a release and say, these areas are closed to fishing right now. And so they have some of those regulations in place already, but
So
there's
it's
only
more
so much they can
adaptation than
do.
prevention, is that right? More adaptation than prevention?
Um, yeah, you can prevent people from just like overfishing and taking
Okay,
advantage
all right.
of a cold situation, basically. There's things that they can do. Um, and then after the freeze, though, I mean, there's not much you can do while it's happening, but afterwards, just conservation measures. There, just the way environmental issues are these days, I am concerned that Parks and Wildlife might have too draconian of issues. Use this as an
Right.
opportunity to be enforcers and say no more fishing for
Mm.
speckled trout for 5 years or something
Huh.
something super extreme like that. Um, so hopefully, I don't think that's going to be the case. Of most of the yeah, I'm more familiar with Parks and Wildlife than I am of other state um, fisheries and wildlife departments, but they seem to have the best interest of the fish and the fishermen, of people and wildlife in mind, and they do a good job
Yeah.
of promoting both, basically.
That's good.
So I think I
You know,
think
I've
if they do anything, it would just be a temporary reduction in limits of speckled trout, uh, something like that. But
Mhm.
then they would monitor the situation and bring the
So
numbers back up.
as far as fish that people consume as food, you've mentioned basically the speckled trout and the redfish. You've also mentioned some that people tend not to consume. Um, and speckled trout and redfish, they're certainly not as commonly consumed as, for example, tuna or salmon or I suppose swordfish, cod, things like that. Um,
Hmm.
are they primarily sort of sport fish, or is there an awful lot of commercial demand for them? I think only a few times have I ever, for example, in restaurants, found redfish on a menu. I think only once that I can recall have I ever seen speckled trout on a restaurant's menu, and I think that was
Yeah.
in New Orleans about 4 or 5 months ago when I was there. And I rarely ever have seen redfish for sale in supermarkets, meat sections, and never that I can recall speckled trout. So are these primarily more sport fish, though still, nice eating if you catch them? Uh,
Yes, yes, they are. They're kind of both, and I think back in and actually, if you read the comments of the What's Up with That article, the H.D. Hess, who I mentioned earlier, I believe it's the same H.D. Hess that wrote Fishes of the Gulf of Mexico. He noted that back in the early 80s, there was commercial fishing for redfish and speckled trout, and that the overfishing from commercial fishing plus sport fishing plus a freeze, that is what helped get legislation passed to basically ban gill netting for redfish and speckled trout in Texas estuaries. And so, so it has been a commercial fishery in the past, but I think now, um, just in terms of economics, the sport fishing industry is just so incredible in Texas that I don't think anybody really wants to disturb that and
uh
bring in commercial fishing as well. So I
Now
think
this,
everybody's pretty content with just having
okay.
it as a sport fish and not also commercial right now.
Now this raises what I think is a very important lesson about environmental stewardship generally, and particularly about the availability of resources, the abundance of resources, especially renewable resources. Uh, it's very, very common in the environmental movement to say that human consumption is just rapidly depleting the resources available to us, whether it be mineral, plant, or animal. And once we've depleted something, there's no coming back. Now, for renewable ones like plants and animals, uh, their populations can recover. But what I notice in this and what you've just described is that as the as the quantity of a given resource, in this case redfish or speckled trout, falls relative to the demand for it, the difficulty of of finding it, of harvesting it, rises considerably. So the price of harvesting it therefore rises. And as a result, also the price of consuming it rises. And as price rises, demand falls. And so what we can see is a sort of a circumstance where the problem itself helps to generate its own solution, because as the declining resource brings about rising prices, consumption falls, and then the resource can recover. Is that something that we've seen with other fisheries as well? And by the way, I'm not assuming that the consumption always falls because people just, out of the goodness of their hearts, decide, oh, I'm going to consume less redfish in order to let the population recover. But there is
Right.
a role, I think, for regulatory bodies to intervene and try to figure out what are sustainable levels of harvest. But is this something that you've seen with other fish species, particularly that are widely used for commercial fishery?
Yes, I've seen it for red snapper. Um, and there's been an ongoing battle between federal and state fisheries over red snapper. Those are mostly in the Gulf of Mexico, not in the estuaries. They're typically in deeper
Uh-huh.
water. Although I did see some that were freeze, part of the freeze kill in the Port Aransas
Hmm.
area in the ship channel right next to Port Aransas. So there's fairly deep water. There's some places 80, 90 foot deep that have some resident red snapper in them. But anyways, um, yeah, there has been kind of a strange battle. And you go out to the locations where the red snapper are, which is typically by an oil and gas platform or some kind of a wreck or a rock structure, um, and you scuba dive around it, and there are thousands of snapper out there. And so I don't know. I don't understand that whole situation. There's some very odd things going on there. There's plenty of snapper for probably more commercial fishing and definitely more sport fishing. Um,
Hmm.
and but
So the regulation
but
can
for
be
some
excessive.
reason, yeah, for some reason, maybe commercial fishermen have better lobbying skills or something. I don't know. It's that's a whole nother issue. We could probably spend a whole hour for sure talking about. It's very interesting and bizarre the way that fishery's been treated.
Hmm.
And yeah,
Yeah.
so
I know that a number of years ago there was real concern over the possibility that cod and haddock populations in the North Atlantic were very severely stressed, and
hmm
so there were actual international treaties that were used to reduce the annual harvest of those, and they seem to have made a very
right,
good comeback. Have you
right.
followed that at all?
I haven't followed those as much as I have striped bass. I remember, back when I was high school age, whatever, junior high, 70s, 80s, the striped bass along the Atlantic coast were really, really low. And yeah, there's like tremendous fisheries now for striped bass.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, that was another one of the overfishing, commercial fishing, and sport fishing too. And I think I don't know. It just seems like in the last 30 years we've learned a lot about how to that we can have an impact, that the oceans
Yeah,
aren't limitless, but we can make it sustainable and renewable, and we can keep it that way. But yeah, we
yeah.
have
I
to.
was just going to say it seems like one of the lessons to take out of this is simply that people can learn, individuals can learn, whole societies can learn. And as we learn more things, we at least have the potential to be better stewards of this earth around us. And That, of course, is what
Right.
the Lord calls us to do in Genesis 1:28, where having made Adam and Eve after his own image, male and female, he blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea," which we're talking about tonight, and the birds of the
Yeah.
air and everything that moves on the face of the earth. And this dominion really should reflect God's own dominion, described in the earlier verses of Genesis chapter 1. Dominion in which God brings everything out of nothing, brings light out of darkness, order out of chaos, life out of non life, and a great variety of life. All of this is what God does, and because He's made us in His image, in our dominion over the earth, we should be doing likewise. And that, of course, is what the Cornwall Alliance is all about. Is pursuing a better understanding of what it means to exercise this godly dominion over the earth. Well, David, thanks again for joining us this evening. Do you have some closing comments for us?
Well, I just want to encourage everybody that yeah, I mean, fish kills sound bad and everything, but um, at the beginning of my article, I talk about ideas versus reality, and we have this idea that keeps changing about you know impending climate catastrophe. And they keep moving the goalposts on exactly when this is. John Kerry just mentioned that it's going to be another 10 years when Al Gore said several years ago it's going to be 2016. That passed. So we have a new goalpost of 2030.
Yeah,
And we just have this idea, but we can compare that to this reality here. We can compare it to the reality of Scripture, like you were talking about Genesis 1. God tells us to rule over creation, mean, be good stewards. That's what he's talking about. Be good
yeah,
managers of it, and we can see the reality of past freeze events and how God's designed things. If we're good stewards, they're gonna bounce back. I had some photos up there of stringers of fish, of my grandsons and I with large fish. The populations bounce back. We sometimes we need somebody to keep our hand out of the cookie jar and slap it, meaning Parks and Wildlife. Um,
uh-huh.
Game wardens, but yeah, we can manage this. And just one other thing, real quick, that I think is fascinating in the 1996 paper by Parks and Wildlife, 1989 freeze, 26 green turtles were found along the coast, and
Hmm.
those are dead ones. That's what they found, and now I mean, this last freeze, there's thousands that they rescued and thousands that also died, but they rescued thousands of them. And I mean, I think that's a good thing. If that's what
It's a huge
a
recovery.
gradually warming climate over the last 30 years is giving us, I mean,
Yeah,
those are good things. And it also shows how we can recover a sea turtle population. We can
yeah,
help keep natural resources in a good and stable way. We can do those things. So
yeah, yeah. Very good. Well,
freezes are
thank you,
bad; they're a
David.
bummer. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you,
But
David.
take heart. It'll get better. It'll get better. Yeah.
I noticed that fairly recently the Babylon Bee, the parody network or parody website, ran an article saying, headlined something like, uh, that we predict that we have only 12 years left until the global warming alarmists move the goalposts again for when disaster has to
Yep.
strike.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, that seems to
Yeah.
happen a great deal. Well, thank
Right.
you
They're
again
good at.
very much.
Yeah, they're good at that. All
Well,
right. Thank you for
thanks again
having
for
me.
joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're you're welcome. It's great to talk with you again. Our friends,
You
I
too.
would remind you once more that from now to the end of March, as long as our supply lasts, we would be delighted to send you a free copy of Inder Gotlani's new publication, Impacts of Climate Change. This would be completely free to you as our way of saying thanks when you make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org. click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in impacts of climate change and promo code 21-03. We'll be glad to send you a free copy, and 100% of your gift will be tax deductible. Well, until next week, we wish you a week full of the blessing of knowing the Lord Jesus Christ, drawing near to Him, and learning from Him what it is to not only be a good steward of the earth, but also a good neighbor to your neighbors in this world where He tells us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Thanks again for joining us. God bless. Have a great week.